When Byron spoke of the Jim Crow era as if it were a time to be admired, Jasmine didn't flinch. She exposed the cost of nostalgia built on pain. The studio froze. What started as a debate quickly turned into a powerful showdown about memory, privilege, and the danger of romanticizing a painful past. So what exactly did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The storm outside Jasmine Crockett's office window had yet to break, but the air inside felt no less electric. Thunder rumbled faintly behind Capitol Hill as she sat motionless at her desk, eyes fixed on a string of headlines flashing across her monitor. Black unemployment rates climbing, access to health care shrinking, crime up, trust down. Another article appeared. Byron Donalds grinning, his quote in bold, "Black families were stronger during Jim Crow." She didn't blink, just leaned back, tapping a pen against her knee like a fuse waiting for flame. Dana, her chief aide, entered without knocking, tablet in hand, voice steady. "Live broadcast. Prime time. They want you to face off with Byron on national TV. Topic, post-pandemic Black America." Jasmine took the tablet, scanned the email, then handed it back without hesitation. "Confirm it," she said, her voice flat as steel, "and tell them I'm not coming to make anybody feel comfortable." 1,000 miles away in Fort Myers, Florida, the sun carved perfect gold lines across the polished floor of Byron Donalds' congressional suite. He stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, not out of vanity but habit, the kind instilled by decades of sharpening his image in rooms that never quite welcomed him. The walls around him were lined with plaques, newspaper clippings, a framed photo with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. He believed in order, discipline, bootstraps. Progress didn't come from protests, it came from ownership. His aide knocked, then entered, holding a manila folder in a cautious tone. "Byron, media request, national spotlight. They want a debate on Black recovery after COVID. Jasmine Crockett is already confirmed." Byron didn't miss a beat. He offered a slow, calculated smile as he took the folder. "Finally," he said, flipping it open, "someone who'll say the quiet part out loud." To him, this wasn't just another media hit. It was a proving ground. He didn't just disagree with Jasmine Crockett. He saw her as emblematic of everything wrong with Black politics. She wore protest like armor. He wore success like proof. To Jasmine, he was a man who traded solidarity for sound bites, who used a Harvard vocabulary to sell a plantation morality. To him, she was all fire and fury with no fiscal map. Two sides of the same struggle, mutually unrecognizable. And what neither of them admitted, not to their teams, not to the mirror, not even to themselves, was that this wouldn't be a debate. It would be a reckoning. Two lives, one stage, and only one voice would leave the studio unshaken. But before the stage lights and microphones, before the first camera blinked red, the war started in the mirror. In a quiet studio dressing room tucked behind the live broadcast set, Jasmine Crockett sat still as a stone, while a young woman in jeans and a headset gently smoothed powder across her cheekbones. Outside, producers scurried, clipboards clutched like shields, countdown clocks ticking toward zero. But inside, Jasmine's mind was miles away, drawn back to a night that still throbbed beneath her skin like an unhealed bruise. She was 9 when it happened. Her father had been arrested for protesting in Louisiana, demanding fair voting access for Black families shut out of the process. Jasmine had watched him get pushed into a patrol car with no sirens, just silence thick enough to choke. That night, her mother sat beside her in the dark and whispered, "One day you'll use your voice so no one can ever silence ours again." Jasmine never forgot it. That voice wasn't just hers now. It was every cracked voice that never got a microphone. 2 rooms away, Byron Donalds adjusted his cufflinks in front of a studio vanity, the scent of hairspray mixing with the scent of memory, the sharp scent of hot sidewalks, boiled pasta, cheap laundry soap. He'd grown up in Crown Heights, where gunshots taught punctuation and ambition was a private thing. His mother had worked double nursing shifts just to keep the lights on, and the landlord quiet. She'd come home with sore ankles and no complaints, just soft hands that never trembled as she signed report cards or eviction notices. At 12, Byron had stood in a cracked mirror, and made himself a promise. No one else gets to write how this ends. Not for me. Not ever again. He didn't believe in fairness. He believed in the fight. And now, standing under soft studio lights, he was ready to remind the world what that fight had taught him. And then, the countdown reached 0. The studio lights didn't blink. They slammed on, bright, white, merciless, erasing shadows, nerves, and any chance of retreat. A deep hush settled across the stage, thick as smoke. On one side of the sleek glass desk sat Congressman Byron Donalds, straight-backed, chin slightly raised, fingers folded with the confidence of a man who'd said this all before and never paid for it. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, still, coiled, alert, not tense, not nervous, just waiting. Her palms rested flat on the table, her notes unopened. Her eyes, unreadable behind heavy lashes, tracked every movement, like a soldier watching the edge of the tree line for the first flicker of trouble. Behind the cameras, producers stood frozen in place, not out of confusion, but because they knew what kind of night this was going to be. They could feel it. The kind of night where headlines write themselves before the credits roll, where history doesn't wait to be approved by committee. The host inhaled shallowly, flipped to his first card, and began the ritual opening. "Good evening, and welcome to America at the Crossroads." His voice was smooth, practiced, designed to mask the minefield he was about to walk both guests into. Tonight we tackle a question that refuses to go away. Why, after years of effort and unprecedented federal aid, are Black communities still disproportionately struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic? He looked to Byron first, not out of favoritism, but calculation. Let the conservative speak first. Let him throw the first spark. "Congressman Donalds," the host asked, turning his full attention to the man in the Navy suit, "what do you believe is at the root of this slow recovery?" Byron didn't hesitate, not for a breath, not for a blink. He leaned slightly into the mic, his tone measured, his cadence preacher smooth, but sharp as a filed-down key. "You know," he began, "back during the Jim Crow era, in the control booth, someone sucked in air too fast. Jasmine blinked once, her body not moving an inch. At least Black families had structure," Byron continued. Another producer muttered under his breath, "Oh no, we had discipline, we had values." The silence was instant and total, not reverent, not confused, just shocked. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch, but the air around her shifted, like barometric pressure before a tornado. Her gaze, focused, steady, cutting, never left his face. Byron kept going. "We didn't wait on handouts. We built. We endured." The host glanced down at his card, pretending to review it. In truth, he was stalling, searching for some invisible line that might bring this conversation back within the guardrails of polite political debate. "And in some ways," Byron said calmly, as if summarizing an economics textbook rather than decades of racial apartheid, "we were stronger for it." A full 2 seconds passed. On set, the temperature hadn't changed, but everyone felt colder. Jasmine still hadn't moved, but the way she sat had changed. She was no longer waiting. She was loading. No one noticed the blinking red light of the live camera anymore. No one cared that this was national television, because in that moment a line had been crossed, not just in content, but in memory, in dignity, in moral gravity. And across the country, Black families who had buried stories instead of loved ones were leaning forward. For a moment, no one breathed. The studio lights hummed overhead, cold and bright, casting a sterile glow on the stage. But the temperature had changed. It wasn't just tense, it was tectonic. The host froze in place, caught between scripts and sense. A camera operator adjusted his grip, hands suddenly damp. In the control room, one producer hovered her finger over the cut-to-break button, but didn't press it, because everyone could feel it. This wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind that needed to be witnessed. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't tap her notes or lean into the mic for effect. She just reached forward, slowly, steadily, and pushed the entire stack of documents to the side with a quiet scrape of paper against glass, as if to say, I didn't bring receipts. I brought memory. I brought pain. I brought what can't be filed or footnoted. Her hands came to rest, fingers laced lightly. Then she lifted her chin and stared, not at the host, not at Byron, but straight down the barrel of the center camera. It wasn't a stare, it was an indictment. And her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It was low, controlled, razor sharp, the kind of voice that wasn't trying to perform, but to expose. "Don't use chains," she said clearly, each word landing with the weight of a gavel, as proof of unity. The host blinked. Byron shifted in his chair, just barely. But Jasmine wasn't speaking for the people in that room. She was speaking for everyone who didn't get a room. "We were not strong because of Jim Crow," she continued, tone steady but rising in gravity. "We were strong in spite of it. And if you can't tell the difference between those two things, then maybe it's not strength you're celebrating. Maybe it's obedience. Maybe it's the kind of survival that comes when you have no choice but to be quiet, to stay small, to disappear." She exhaled once. It wasn't fatigue, it was restraint. "You know what made us fragile?" she asked, eyes narrowing only slightly. "It wasn't COVID. It wasn't the virus." Then came the second line, this time spoken more like an elegy than a statement. "COVID didn't make us weak. It didn't break our communities. What made us vulnerable," she said, her voice threading between heartbreak and fury, "was the silence. The silence of history that erased our stories, ignored our pain, and then told us to be grateful we're still standing." No one interrupted her. Not the host, not the crew, not Byron. "Don't confuse resilience with justice," she added, the words softer now, almost like a warning. "Don't mistake the ability to endure for the presence of peace. You talk about families under Jim Crow as if they were whole, but you forget why they had to hold each other so tight, because everything else in the world was trying to pull them apart." She finally turned toward Byron, not sharply, not theatrically, just enough. "And when you tell people we were better off back then," she said, "what exactly are you asking us to go back to?" Stillness. Not quiet, not yet, but stillness. The kind that only comes when a truth too long buried finally surfaces, when pain gets a mic and it doesn't apologize for taking the time to speak. There was a pause, sharp, full, electric. Not the kind of silence that settles, but the kind that tightens around the room like a grip. For a split second, even the air seemed to hold its breath. In the control booth, no one moved. The producer's hand hovered over the mute button, but didn't press it. The moderator, frozen between duty and instinct, sensed what everyone else did. This wasn't a moment to manage. This was a moment to survive. Jasmine turned her full body toward Byron, not rushed, not theatrical, just direct. The papers in front of her lay untouched now, meaningless. The script was over. What came next would be written in real time, in scars and in memory. Her voice came low, calm, but sharpened by something ancient and personal. "You're saying Jim Crow was good for families?" she asked, and the steel in her tone could cut through years of whitewashed textbooks. "That's only because you've never had it crush you beneath its foot." No one interrupted her. Not the host, not the crew, not Byron. Her words didn't fill the room with volume, but they flooded it with weight. It felt like the truth had finally gotten its turn to speak, and it had no intention of asking politely. Across from her, Byron's jaw clenched just enough to register frustration or restraint. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. But something in him coiled tighter. "I'm just saying," he said, with the forced calm of someone who knows he's losing control of the moment. "Back then we were stronger. We didn't live on government handouts." It was the kind of line meant to provoke while pretending it wasn't. A history lesson rewritten into a talking point. A wound reduced to a policy debate, and Jasmine knew it. You could see it in the way her eyes didn't leave him, the way she didn't rush to respond. She let it sit for a second. Let everyone feel how absurd it was. Then, with the quiet power of someone who's lived through what others only study, she answered. Not with rage, but with something stronger. Live certainty. "We weren't strong because of Jim Crow," she said. Her voice didn't rise, but it resonated like a bell in a stone church. "We survived in spite of it." The sentence didn't land like a punch. It landed like truth falling into place. like a lock clicking shut on a door that would never be opened again. And then, stillness. Not confusion, not awkwardness, recognition. The kind that humbles, the kind that hurts, the kind that makes people look down, not because they're ashamed of what was said, but because they know it can't be argued. Because for a moment, just one, everyone understood. Not one word needed to follow it. The silence was already speaking. The silence stretched, not like a pause in conversation, but like a held breath in a room afraid to exhale. Jasmine didn't let it break. Instead, she leaned forward, not in aggression, but in weight. The weight of memory, of family, of truth she had not read in books but lived through bones. When she spoke again, her voice was low and careful, not because she was unsure, but because what she was about to say demanded reverence. "You know," she said slowly, like unfolding a fragile photograph, "my grandfather kept a notebook." Byron's brows dipped just slightly, curious, wary, but he said nothing. Jasmine's hands rested flat on the desk, steady as granite, though her fingers curled slightly as if holding something invisible. A room full of lights and cameras watched her, but in her mind, she wasn't on a stage. She was back in her grandfather's house, where the floor creaked and the air smelled like tobacco and time. "It was a small, worn-out book," she continued, "leather cover, binding frayed at the edges. He didn't keep it on a shelf. He kept it wrapped in a rubber band. In the same drawer he kept the radio and his reading glasses." She inhaled once, not to calm herself, but to gather what came next. Every so often, usually late at night when the house was quiet, he'd take it out. He never read it aloud. He never told stories from it. I only saw him open it a few times, but I asked him once what it was. Her voice grew quieter, but more precise. He said it was a record, a list of names, people from his town, from nearby counties, mostly black men, a few women. All of them disappeared during Jim Crow. Some went missing after talking back to a white store clerk. Some were found days later. Some were never found at all. Her voice didn't crack, but it didn't need to. The silence she carried did all the breaking. They weren't martyrs. They weren't heroes in textbooks. They were neighbors, customers, kids, people who simply walked out of their homes and never made it back. Now she turned to Byron, not with rage, not even confrontation, just a clean, direct gaze that asked him to meet her at the edge of truth. "My grandfather wrote them down," she said, "because he knew no one else would. Not the sheriff, not the local newspaper, not the history books." Another pause, not for drama, but because that truth needed space. And then Jasmine delivered the question, slow, deliberate, her voice sharp but heartbreakingly calm. "Do you remember any names of the people who were lynched?" she asked. A beat. "Or do you just remember the dinner table being full?" The words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They landed like a stone in water, heavy, rippling, permanent. In the control room, producers stared at each other, frozen. Behind the cameras, a tech assistant wiped at the corner of his eye and pretended it was dust. And across living rooms, phones, classrooms, and kitchens all over America, people didn't move. Because when someone tells the truth like that, the only honest thing to do is listen. The silence after Jasmine's words about names, the ones lost, the ones no longer spoken, was not the kind of silence that fades. It was the kind that settled like fog, thick and immovable, coating every inch of the studio. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the stage lights seemed to dim, as if the room itself knew that a line had been crossed, not in aggression, but in revelation. And then Jasmine did something rare for a televised debate. She didn't pivot. She didn't press for applause. She simply let the weight of her own memories breathe. Her fingers, resting on a stack of papers, curled slightly as if holding on to something invisible but deeply real. "When you live too close to privilege," she said finally, "it gets easier to forget what pain feels like." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't delivered with fanfare. It landed softly, but it cracked something open. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. Exhaustion that didn't come from the conversation at hand, but from the thousands of conversations like it. Conversations she'd had to endure her whole life. Conversations where people smiled while rewriting suffering into structure. Across from her, Byron inhaled slowly, his jaw visibly tightening, his hands folded on the table, too tight, too deliberate. He was trying to hold the line, but her words had already pierced it. Still, he met her gaze. "Who I love," he said, "doesn't make me any less black." The sentence hovered, not defensive, not loud, just firm. The kind of thing a man says when he's tired of having to explain his existence. Jasmine didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She studied him, not as a rival, not even as a politician, but as a man she once might have shared a sidewalk with in another life. One who'd maybe walked the same roads, but somehow ended up building a house on a different street. She drew a breath, shallow, careful, and spoke again. "Love doesn't erase history," she said. "It just changes which parts of it you're allowed to ignore." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was no rage behind the words, only clarity. And it stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. Brutally, unavoidably honest. For a moment, Byron didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, holding the silence like a mirror he didn't want to look into. And across America, in living rooms and break rooms and classrooms, the stillness on screen bled into the homes of everyone watching, because in that instant, they weren't seeing two politicians. They were witnessing the fallout of history, colliding in real time. The studio lights dimmed, but the nation had already lit its own fire. It started with a ripple, a clip moment from the debate, just 9 seconds long. Jasmine Crockett, framed by the camera like a courtroom witness, looked straight ahead and said, "We don't need nostalgia, we need acknowledgement." The TikTok was posted by a Howard University student with no prior following. Within an hour, it had 400,000 views. By nightfall, it was stitched, subtitled, dissected in dorm rooms, churches, and barbershops. On Twitter, the hashtag number CROCKETSPOKETRUTH surged from obscurity to trending in 12 states. People didn't just repost it, they added their own stories. A mother in Detroit quoted Jasmine and added, "I lost my father to COVID while the government debated if we mattered." A teacher in Georgia wrote, "We told our students to study history and then we punished them for remembering it out loud." Comment threads weren't just chatter, they were testimonies. Survivors of redlining, children of the war on drugs, voters who'd waited in 6-hour lines in black neighborhoods, all suddenly speaking with the same rhythm. Not rage, but release. It wasn't just Jasmine's words, it was the way she had said them, calm but cutting, righteous but not rehearsed. America wasn't used to seeing a black woman speak that clearly, that directly, and still hold the room. While Crockett's voice echoed like a drumbeat through timelines, Byron Donald's name began trending too, but under very different lights. Civil rights organizations issued terse statements by morning. One group, the National Council for Racial Justice, called his remarks a polished apologia for generational violence. Black Lives Matter. Philadelphia issued a sharper rebuke. "This is what happens when power seduces memory. Mr. Donalds may have forgotten the lash, but the rest of us haven't." Even moderate black coalitions, who once supported Byron for his push for economic opportunity, now hesitated. The NAACP didn't name him outright, but shared a thread titled, "What Jim Crow Really Meant, a Reminder." Newsrooms scrambled. Commentators, many of whom had planned for a mild policy recap, were now re-editing packages into primetime pieces about racial memory and historical gaslighting. On CNN, Van Jones called the moment a generational gut check. On Fox News, a host warned, "This is what happens when the left weaponizes emotion against facts." But even there, something cracked. A conservative anchor paused mid-rant and admitted, "Honestly, I'm still trying to process what she said, because it didn't feel political, it felt personal." And in the chaos of all this noise, Byron Donald sat in a dimly lit car outside his home in Naples, Florida, watching the clips on loop. Jasmine's face, her voice, that TikTok. We don't need nostalgia. We need acknowledgement. Over and over again, his wife, Marlene, had gone silent after dinner. Not angry, just distant. He'd tried to explain his point, about values, about family, about strength, but the words had begun to feel like paper shields against a storm that had already arrived. In the back of his mind, a line from the debate replayed, the one Jasmine hadn't yelled but whispered. Love doesn't erase history. It just shifts what part you're allowed to ignore. Meanwhile, in South Dallas, Jasmine Crockett walked into her district office to find 3 bouquets waiting. No names, just handwritten notes. One read, "Thank you for saying what my mother was too tired to explain." Another, "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised mine." Dana, her communications director, burst into the room. "It's everywhere," she said breathlessly. "People aren't just reposting you. They're organizing. They're writing letters to editors. Churches are quoting you, and colleges want you to speak." Jasmine sank slowly into her chair, eyes fixed on the wall where her father's mugshot from the 1965 Baton Rouge protest hung in a black frame. His expression there, half defiant, half worn, looked more familiar than ever. She thought of how he used to tell her, "The louder the silence, the deeper the truth." And suddenly she wasn't tired. She wasn't shaken. She was focused. Because the debate might have ended, but the real conversation about pain, proximity, memory, and identity had only just begun. The hearing was over. Cameras powered down. Microphones were unplugged. Aides buzzed around like bees trying to rebuild a hive that had just been struck by lightning. But Jasmine didn't move. Not immediately. She stood just inside the chamber doors, watching Byron disappear down the hallway toward the private side exit reserved for members. He didn't look back. Not that she expected him to. 27 minutes ago, they'd stood under the same lights, in front of the same audience, speaking the same language, and yet telling 2 completely different truths. Now the world outside that room was roaring with hashtags, opinion threads, push alerts, and think pieces. But here, in the long stretch of marbled silence between committee rooms, the noise hadn't caught up yet. Only the truth remained, bare, unpolished, unspun. Byron stood near a tall window at the end of the hallway. From there, the Capitol dome was framed like a photograph in motionless glass, an idealized silhouette of government that had just witnessed 2 of its own go to ideological war in full view of the nation. His suit was still crisp, but the shoulders sagged just slightly, as if something internal had unbuttoned. He didn't say anything at first, not until he heard her heels, not the echo of them, just the simple, steady rhythm of someone who wasn't done yet. "I was trying to talk about family," he said quietly, his back still turned. His voice had dropped an octave from its on-air cadence. No longer polished, not defensive. Almost weary. "About values, that's all. That's where I was coming from." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She reached him slowly, folding her arms not in defiance but in containment. The restraint it takes not to scream, not to educate someone for the 100th time, not to make him feel what she'd already spent a lifetime surviving. She stared out the same window but didn't see the dome. She saw her father in cuffs outside a polling station in East Baton Rouge. She saw her grandfather's journals, yellowed with time and stained with names of people who disappeared before they ever made it onto the rolls of history. She saw the little girl in her mother's lap whispering, "They don't hear us," and her mother whispering back, "Then one day you'll make them." When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice was low but unshakably clear, the kind of clarity that didn't need a microphone to be heard. "Wrong moment," she said. Byron turned toward her, brows knitting as if to plead without pleading. "Wrong example." Another pause. "And wrong tone." She didn't deliver the words like a punchline. She delivered them like a verdict. Byron opened his mouth, started to speak, then stopped. His jaw shifted, locked, then relaxed again. The words were there, but they were hollow, and he knew it. In that moment, whatever notes his team had prepped, whatever rhetorical defense he had rehearsed in green rooms across the country, none of it fit. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. A pause long enough to cut between posture and truth. "You think I was trying to erase pain?" he finally asked, not in anger but confusion. "I was raised by a single mom. Crown Heights. Crack on the corners, police in the alleys. I know pain." Jasmine's eyes didn't narrow. They softened, but not in sympathy, in sadness. A kind of grief that comes not when someone argues with you, but when they genuinely don't understand why their words felt like betrayal. It's not about erasing pain, she said. It's about how we measure strength. You stood on that stage and pointed to Jim Crow as proof of family unity, as if oppression was the glue, as if fear was the foundation. He looked down at the polished floor. I was trying to say we held together back then. And I'm saying, she replied, we shouldn't have had to. The hallway grew heavier. A Senate staffer walked by, recognized them both, and turned away quickly, like witnessing something holy or radioactive. Maybe both. Byron ran a hand along the back of his neck. His skin, usually warm with confidence, looked suddenly thinner under the fluorescent light. I wasn't trying to romanticize it, he said, quieter still. Jasmine shook her head, not in anger, but in the ache of too many conversations like this one. It doesn't matter what you were trying to do, she said. It matters what you gave permission for others to believe. He winced, just slightly, enough for her to know it landed. I said what I said, he replied, still holding on to something he didn't name. But I said it to remind people we had dignity. She stepped in just a little closer, not confrontationally, but with gravity. The kind of gravity that pulled truth out of silence. Dignity doesn't need to come wrapped in chains. Byron blinked. Hard. They stood in stillness again. The Capitol buzzed beyond the glass and down the corridor. Journalists filed early headlines. Twitter melted through its latest rotation of fury and allegiance. TikTok videos were already being stitched together with her quotes, his pauses, and the stunned expressions of the moderator caught in between. But here, just here, it was simple. Two people who shared a color, but not a code. Two voices that had risen from different roots, but were now caught in the same storm. Jasmine turned to go. She didn't need to win the last word, but as she passed him, she said it anyway. Software unforgiving. Family doesn't mean silence, and values don't mean forgetting where the bruises came from. She didn't look back. Byron didn't follow. But for the first time all night, he didn't feel like the last word belonged to him. She didn't look back, and yet the world kept following. From the sterile marble hallway of the Capitol to the raw, restless heartbeat of America. Jasmine's words refused to stay confined to C-SPAN replays or political recaps. They pulsed outward like a drumbeat, through dorm rooms lit with laptop screens, through community centers still haunted by silence, through churches where the pews were missing entire families lost during COVID. Her voice, calm, unsparing, alive with memory, wasn't just something people heard. It was something they carried. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, invitations poured in, not from cable news anchors or late-night talk shows, but from the places that mattered most. Southside Chicago, Baton Rouge, Oakland, Flint, Howard University, Spelman, Jackson State, places where grief hadn't been given a podium, where COVID didn't just take lives, it exposed the fault lines under them. Jasmine didn't seek the spotlight, but she didn't run from it either. She walked straight into the rooms that others had overlooked. The first speech was at a small auditorium in Milwaukee, standing room only. Rows of chairs filled with mothers who had buried more than one name, college students still wearing masks more out of trauma than habit, grandmothers holding photos of sons who died alone. There were no campaign banners, no applause meters, no consultants in the back of the room whispering about optics. Just people, wounded, waiting, watching. Jasmine stood at the edge of the stage, not behind the podium. She wore black, not for style, but for truth. And when she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. They told us it was a pandemic, but for some of us, it felt like confirmation. The room went still. Confirmation that when systems crack, we're the ones who fall through. A woman in the third row began to cry, not loudly, but with that silent kind of weeping that comes when you finally feel seen. During COVID, Jasmine continued, we lost elders who were holding the last threads of memory. We lost parents who were holding 3 jobs and a child's hand. And when we asked why the resources didn't reach us, they told us to be patient. Patient while the air left our lungs. She paused. Let it settle. Byron wanted to talk about families under Jim Crow. I want to talk about families now. Families who live three to a room because redlining never left. Families who can't get a loan because their zip code speaks louder than their credit score. She didn't name him to attack. She named him to frame the stakes. It wasn't a feud. It was a fault line. A professor in the front row nodded slowly, her eyes glossy. She had taught about structural racism for 20 years, but Jasmine made it breathe. Strength isn't surviving oppression quietly, Jasmine said. Strength is looking injustice in the face and refusing to be gaslit by nostalgia. The audience stood, not in a choreographed way, but in a wave, like something inside them had been called up to its feet. The speech went viral. Again. But this time, it wasn't the clip of the debate. It was Jasmine's new sentence, recorded by a student's cracked iPhone, and posted with a caption that read simply, "She said what we were all trying to say." "We don't need nostalgia," Jasmine had said. "We need recognition." That clip was played on church projectors in Alabama. It was printed on posters in Newark. It was sampled into a spoken word piece by a black teenager in Minneapolis whose brother had died alone in an overfilled ICU while waiting for a ventilator that never came. The next week, she spoke in Detroit, then New Orleans, then in a modest Quaker meeting house in rural North Carolina, where an elderly black woman took her hand afterward and whispered, "You remind me of Fannie Lou Hamer, if she carried a law degree and fire in both fists." But not every response was admiration. Conservative outlets accused her of politicizing pain. Online pundits tried to twist her words into anger. One Fox host asked if she hated America. Jasmine didn't respond with press releases or think pieces. She responded by showing up. In Pittsburgh, she met with union organizers who had lost a third of their membership to COVID. In the Bronx, she sat in a barbershop with 3 teenage boys who asked, "Why didn't anyone come for us sooner?" She didn't offer them easy answers. She offered them memory and the tools to build something louder than it. Byron, meanwhile, was disinvited from a conservative family values conference in South Carolina. Quietly, no press release. Just a call from the organizers suggesting this year might not be the right time. A leaked email from a church-affiliated past described his comments as historically misinformed and politically costly. One line in the message stuck out. "When we erase the pain of the past, we betray the people who still carry its scars." He made fewer appearances. He posted a video clarifying that he never meant to glorify oppression, but the comments section had already been claimed. Most of them weren't even angry. They were disappointed. And Jasmine kept moving. She didn't gloat. She didn't tweet triumphs. Instead, she spoke in Fresno, where she met a nurse who had lost both parents and now worked night shifts because grief didn't pay bills. She walked through a black cemetery in Georgia where fresh graves had no headstones yet, because families were still choosing between rent and markers. At one event, a child asked her, "Are you a hero?" Jasmine crouched down and said, "No, baby. I'm just someone who didn't let them turn my silence into safety." And that became the new quote. Not a slogan, a map. But while Jasmine rose into a whirlwind of affirmation and solidarity, Byron began to feel something else entirely. Distance. Not from his beliefs, but from the people who once applauded them. It started quietly, as political shifts often do, not with headlines or protests, but with silence. Emails once replied to in minutes now took days. The Sunday calls from senior party aides were rescheduled indefinitely. And then came the phone call from Ohio. The conference was set to be one of the largest religious gatherings in the Midwest, Faith and Family Values, hosted in Columbus, where Byron had spoken 3 times before, each to standing ovations. But this year was different. This year, his name was pulled from the keynote list, just 36 hours after it had gone public. The call came from the event director, a man Byron had hugged after his 2022 speech, and who once told him, "You're what our sons need to see." The man's voice now, hesitant, measured, drenched in PR. "We're going in a slightly different direction this year," he said after a long, awkward pause. "With everything going on online and the feedback we're getting from donors, we just think it's best to limit distractions." "Distractions," Byron repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "We still appreciate your leadership," the man added too quickly. Truly, this just isn't the right time. He didn't hang up immediately. He stared at his phone, as if waiting for it to correct itself, to undo what it had just done. But all it gave him was his own reflection in the black screen: sharp suit, perfectly trimmed beard, and eyes that suddenly looked much older. That night he didn't post. He didn't issue a statement. He sat in his Florida office, alone with the hum of the ceiling fan, and reread the headline that had accelerated his unraveling. Donald's Jim Crow comments ignite firestorm. It wasn't even the article that cut deepest. It was the comments beneath it, many from people he thought were in his corner. Thought he was smarter than that. Not a good look, Byron. Sad to see someone who made it forget where he came from. He scrolled in silence until he reached one that hit harder than the rest. A user with a small profile picture, just a church pew, wrote, "He forgot the difference between surviving and being free." By the end of the week, 2 Republican senators unfollowed him on social media. One conservative PS removed his photo from its endorsement page. And when he walked into a closed-door GOP meeting on Capitol Hill that Friday, the room didn't quite go cold, but it did shift. Conversations paused just long enough to make him feel like an intruder. And when he tried to offer a handshake to a younger congressman from Texas, the man nodded stiffly and turned back toward his staffer. It wasn't mutiny, it was abandonment. In a party that prized unity, Byron was becoming radioactive. Not because he had said something shocking. No, most of them had said worse in private. But because he had said it on camera. And Jasmine had been there to meet it with a truth no talking point could outshine. A week later, he received an official recommendation from his communications team to avoid further media appearances until the climate cools. He didn't argue. He just nodded. He still believed what he said, at least parts of it. He still believed in self-reliance, in discipline, in the power of family. But something had shifted inside him, even if he couldn't name it yet. A realization that belief without listening could become blindness. That you couldn't talk about history without carrying the bodies it left behind. He tried to work, filed reports, met with constituents, but everything now felt thinner, as if the foundation he had built his public identity on was cracking under the weight of context. And then came the memo from party leadership. No signatures, just an anonymous advisory distributed to key committees outlining talking points to avoid, references to slavery-era institutions, family structure under segregation, and most pointedly, unqualified comparisons between systemic injustice and modern policy debates. Byron wasn't named, but he didn't need to be. The final blow came quietly in a hallway he had walked 100 times. A journalist stopped him, not for an interview, just for a comment. "Do you think Jasmine Crockett exaggerated the pain of Jim Crow to win the argument?" Byron didn't blink. "I think she reminded America who paid the price for forgetting," he said softly. And for the first time in days, the journalist had nothing to say. The lights in the Detroit University auditorium weren't kind. They were harsh, clinical, buzzing with the quiet hum of institutional memory. But Jasmine Crockett stood beneath them without flinching. She didn't ask for the lights to be dimmed. She didn't glance at the teleprompter. Her notes lay untouched on the podium, folded, not forgotten. This wasn't a policy speech. It was something heavier, something older, something that demanded more than applause. She took a breath that wasn't for nerves. It was for grounding. "Being Black in America isn't a template," Jasmine began, her voice firm, but carrying a gentleness that almost startled the packed room. "We're not monolithic. We don't all vote the same. We don't all worship the same. But pain," she let that word settle, "pain has patterns, and if you live long enough, you learn to recognize the shape of it." The auditorium held nearly 700 people, students, professors, cafeteria workers, mothers, and the newly grieving. Some wore masks, not just out of health precaution, but to shield tears they hadn't finished shedding. In the front row sat a woman who'd lost her husband and both parents in the same month of the pandemic. Behind her, a group of public health majors clutched clipboards, their pens idle. Jasmine's eyes didn't search for approval. They scanned for connection. "Pain," she said again, "repeats itself when no one bothers to name it the first time." She wasn't preaching. She was reporting, from the inside out, from the wound. I've been asked, she continued, why I speak like I do, why I won't smooth the edges of my voice or sit politely when someone romanticizes an era that nearly erased people like me. I'm asked why I won't debate civilly with folks who traffic in polite cruelty. She gave a dry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Here's why. I've seen what silence costs. My family has paid the bill more than once. She paused. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. My grandfather, she said, wasn't a lawyer. He never ran for office. But he had a notebook, spiral-bound, kept it in a drawer under the radio. And in that notebook, he wrote names. Names of black men and women from our town in Louisiana who disappeared, who were taken, beaten, jailed, or never came back from a walk. Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it deepened. He told me, we keep the names, Jasmine, because if we don't, they never existed. A shudder moved through the room like wind through tall grass. Jasmine let it pass before she continued. When I speak, it's not for sound bites. It's for the people in that notebook. It's for the aunt who raised a household while the government labeled her lazy. It's for the neighbor who died gasping for air while the nearest hospital said, we're at capacity. It's for every child who had to Zoom into class while grieving someone who couldn't afford to go to a doctor. At that, a student in the third row lowered her phone, stopped recording, and just watched, bare-faced, raw, and fully present. A clip from her televised debate had gone viral earlier that week. A TikTok account called Real Talk for Change had looped her most cutting line. We don't need nostalgia, we need acknowledgement. It had over 4 million views. Not because it was flashy, because it was true. Jasmine didn't reference the clip. She didn't need to. I don't come here today with answers wrapped in ribbon, she said. I come here with truth that hasn't been filtered through poll testing or softened for respectability. A professor near the back rubbed his hands together nervously, visibly moved. One of the university's trustees, an older black woman in a navy blue suit, lowered her head for a moment, pressing her fingertips together in a silent amen. I say this to the next generation, Jasmine continued, her voice gaining a sharper edge. If you have a voice, use it. Use it when it's inconvenient. Use it when it costs you. Use it not to rewrite the struggle, but to remember it correctly. Not to make it polite, but to make it impossible to ignore. Now the room stirred, not with noise, but with electricity. If they tell you to wait your turn, ask them what time they're keeping, because we've been waiting since before they let us read. Then she stopped speaking, not for applause, but because she had said enough. What followed wasn't a cheer or standing ovation. It was a silence so complete it could have cracked glass. The kind of silence that only happens when truth stops a room cold. Not because people disagree, but because they suddenly remember something they've been trying not to. And far beyond that auditorium, miles away in a fifth-grade classroom in Houston, Mr. Lincoln, a history teacher with sleeves rolled up and a quiet defiance in his eyes, played that same debate clip on a dusty smartboard. He didn't speak while it played. He let Jasmine's words do the work. When the clip ended, a student raised his hand. Mr. Lincoln, he asked, did she get in trouble for saying all that? Mr. Lincoln smiled, not smugly, but with the kind of relief that comes from knowing something true had landed exactly where it needed to. No, he said, she got heard. And somewhere in Detroit, as Jasmine Crockett stepped off the stage and back into the shadows of the university hallway, she didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible, because being heard was just the beginning. It had been 3 weeks since Jasmine Crockett walked off that soundstage, but the world hadn't moved on. Not really. What was meant to be just another televised debate had turned into something else entirely, a cultural reckoning captured in high definition and replayed on every device with a screen. But tonight wasn't about ratings or sound bites. Tonight, Jasmine stood backstage at a small community theater in Birmingham, Alabama, far from the lights of Capitol Hill, farther still from the suits who'd tried to define her tone. The stage wasn't large. The spotlight didn't hum. There were no countdowns in her earpiece. Just a row of folding chairs, a few local organizers checking microphones, and an audience of 400, many of whom had buried someone during COVID and never had the words to say what it did to them. She adjusted her blazer, no teleprompter, no notes. Just her voice, raw, imperfect, but wholly hers. When she stepped out, the room went still. No cheers, no clapping, just an expectant quiet. The kind that didn't ask her to perform, only to tell the truth. She began slowly. "There's something about grief that doesn't end with funerals," she said, her tone low, worn in. "It lingers in grocery lists that don't include your mother anymore. It waits in voicemail inboxes you haven't opened since the hospital. It doesn't need your permission to stay. And when a nation loses over 1 million people in silence, without acknowledgement, without proper mourning, that grief becomes something else." A pause. She looked out into the rows of faces, young, old, scarred in different ways. "It becomes policy." You could hear someone exhale in the back. She continued, recounting the email she got from a grandmother in Mississippi whose daughter died alone in a rural ICU because there were no ventilators left. She read, almost trembling, the line that stuck with her the most. They called her death preventable. But what about her life? Wasn't that worth preserving too? Jasmine leaned forward, gripping the podium now. "When we let grief turn into numbers, we let justice shrink into budgets." The crowd stirred, not with noise, but with weight. "This is why I walked into that studio 3 weeks ago," she said. "Not to win an argument, not to trend, but because I've buried too many voices that never got to speak." She paused again, this time not for drama, but because her throat tightened and wouldn't let the next sentence out right away. When she did speak, it was softer, but far more cutting. "Byron said we were stronger back then, that Jim Crow brought order, but he never sat next to his grandfather and heard about the neighbors who never came back. My grandfather kept a notebook, names, dates, one word beside each name, vanished. That's what unity under oppression looks like. It's not community, it's survival." Now the crowd did respond, a slow wave of murmurs, of agreement, of something deeper. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man near the exit bowed his head, and then she gave them the line that would live far beyond this room. "We don't need nostalgia, we need recognition." The silence that followed wasn't stillness, it was solidarity. She stepped back. No standing ovation, no need, just nods. Hundreds of them, some in tears, others with fists clenched, but all of them listening. And somewhere in a middle school in Ohio, a social studies teacher played that same speech, the one that had only aired on local public TV, for a class of 13-year-olds. One of the kids raised their hand after Jasmine said, "Grief without justice is just silence with better lighting." The boy asked, "Did she get in trouble for saying that?" The teacher smiled, not patronizing, but with a kind of reverence. "No," he said, "she got heard." The applause never quite reached a roar. It didn't have to. What Jasmine had offered wasn't a performance to be rewarded. It was a reckoning to be remembered. And as she walked down the narrow hallway backstage, unguarded and alone, the weight of what had just transpired hung on her shoulders like a soaked flag. Not heavy with regret, heavy with responsibility, because what she'd stirred in that room and across the country wasn't just conversation, it was memory. Memory sharpened into clarity, pain that demanded purpose. And now as the lights dimmed behind her and the sound crew unplugged their cords, the real question pressed in from the silence. What now? Because every story worth telling leaves behind a question that can't be ignored. And this one? It left behind a mirror. The lesson wasn't about left or right. It wasn't even about Byron or Jasmine. It was about what happens when a society forgets that dignity has a history and that history has teeth. It was about the cost of nostalgia, how it can sanitize horror, how it can package suffering in soft language and sell it back to the wounded as strength. Byron didn't come to that stage to offend, but neither did he come to remember. And that was the heart of the matter. Forgetting is easier than facing, especially when the pain wasn't yours to carry in the first place. But Jasmine remembered, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't afford not to. She remembered a father who came home with cracked ribs from a voting rights march, A mother who kept ice packs and silence in equal measure. A grandfather who wrote names of missing neighbors like he was scribbling prayers no one would answer. These weren't abstract tales. They were inheritance. And in a world eager to bury the past under talking points, Jasmine chose to exhume it. That choice was the story, because courage isn't volume, it's clarity. It's the decision to speak plainly when euphemisms are safer. It's looking a colleague in the eye, someone who shares your skin but not your view, and telling him that his version of the past might comfort him, but it costs others too much to be left unchecked. Jasmine's voice wasn't designed to soothe. It was designed to cut through static, and it did. It cut through the algorithms that reward outrage but punish nuance. It cut through the punditry that reduces identity to a demographic box. It cut through the idea that success in Black America must look one way, think one way, vote one way. What she offered wasn't a script. It was a challenge. Can you love your people enough to tell them the truth, even when it's inconvenient? That was the lesson. Because justice isn't just a verdict. It's memory honored. It's pain acknowledged. It's saying, we survived despite. And then fighting so others won't have to do the same. And what Byron didn't understand, or couldn't admit, was that silence isn't strength. Politeness isn't progress. You can't reconcile what you refuse to remember. And you can't uplift people by erasing the ground they bled on. By the time Jasmine reached her hotel room that night, she knew the backlash would come. It always did. Some would call her divisive, others ungrateful. A few would even accuse her of weaponizing pain, but she didn't care. Not because she was immune, but because she was clear. Don't confuse survival with healing, she had said, and don't confuse my willingness to remember with your comfort to forget. That line alone had made its way into classrooms, sermons, campaign speeches. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And in a country still dragging its trauma behind it like an invisible anchor, honesty was its own kind of revolution. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to rewrite history. She came to rescue it. And in doing so, she reminded every Black child who'd ever been told to move on, every elder whose grief had been brushed off as ancient wounds, every family that buried more than a loved one during the pandemic, that their stories mattered. That memory was not a burden, but a weapon, that the truth might not set them free overnight, but it would keep them from being erased. That's the legacy of what happened on that debate stage. Not a viral clip, not a trending hashtag, but a restored voice. And the lesson? That history doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be heard. But remembering, as Jasmine made clear, is only the beginning, because memory without movement is just mourning. She stood not for applause, but for action. And now that action must shift from one voice on a stage to many in the streets, the classrooms, the courtrooms, and the ballot boxes. Jasmine's words echoed like a live wire through the country's spine, not because they were beautifully delivered, but because they were painfully overdue. And they left everyone watching with a choice: stand in silent admiration or stand with her. Because if truth is only admired and never enacted, then it dies in the air it travels. She made it clear: don't just retweet my courage, replicate it. And that is the call. To the student sitting in a classroom where Black history is treated like a footnote, ask the hard questions. When they teach you about America's greatness, ask them to show you the full picture: the hands that built the railroads without pay, the backs that bent to pick cotton under the sun, the ballots that bled ink and blood. Ask not out of defiance, but out of devotion to truth. Because silence is not safety, it's surrender. To the teacher unsure if they should include stories that make some parents uncomfortable, teach them anyway, not to shame the children, but to free them. Because ignorance doesn't protect, it imprisons. Jasmine's story didn't start on a stage. It started in a home where her father's bruises taught her what voting really costs. That story deserves a place in every civics class in the nation. To the voter who has given up believing their voice matters, look again. Look at what one woman did with a microphone and her memory. Look at the ripple she became. When institutions forget you, remembering yourself becomes a revolutionary act. And voting is more than a right. It's a refusal to vanish. To the Black professionals navigating spaces that question their presence, stand tall. Jasmine didn't soften her voice to be accepted. She sharpened it to be heard. You don't need to shrink to fit into a boardroom. Make the room rise to meet you, and if it won't, build another one. To the allies who were moved but unsure what to do next, start with listening, then keep going. Don't just praise the Jasmine Crocketts of the world for speaking. Protect them when they're attacked. Amplify their message when it's drowned out. Invest in the communities they defend. Allyship isn't a sticker. It's a seat at the table with your wallet, your vote, and your backbone. And to the policymakers watching from the sidelines, understand this. Truth is coming for you. It may wear a suit. It may quote legal precedent. It may sit in hearings and smile for the cameras. But beneath it will be the names of every grandmother denied health care, every family broken by a false arrest, every child born into a zip code where funding dies on arrival. Jasmine didn't just speak for herself, she summoned them all. And she isn't done, because the next stage won't be made of polished wood under hot studio lights. It'll be the floor of Congress, the bench of the courtroom, the streets where protests become policy. The debate wasn't the climax, it was the drumbeat. The real battle is who gets to write tomorrow's textbooks, design tomorrow's laws, shape tomorrow's memory. So stand with her, not with applause, with action. Call your representatives. Demand curriculum reform that tells the whole truth, not just the comfortable version. Fund mental health resources in communities ravaged by loss. Repeal policies that criminalize poverty and call it justice. Create space at the table, then build longer tables. And when they tell you this isn't your fight, remind them, injustice anywhere is a blueprint. Jasmine didn't fight for a headline. She fought to break the pattern. And now the pattern is cracking. But it won't shatter unless we all press in. Because legacy doesn't begin in marble halls. It begins with choices, small, daily, dangerous, necessary. So choose. Choose to remember out loud. Choose to speak when history asks you to hush. Choose to make your outrage useful, your grief strategic, your voice relentless. Because in the end, the world doesn't change because someone tells the truth once. It changes when enough people decide never to let it be forgotten. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.